Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back from your break, and welcome to the final parallel session of Calc 26. Um, I'd like to welcome Sam Popowich, who's going to be doing our final session. Take it away, Sam. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So I think you should be, wait, I think you're not seeing.
Yeah, we can see it.
You see it? Okay, great. Okay, perfect. There we go. Okay. I'm going to talk to you today about citational justice and what's called the capabilities approach in political science and economics. So my name is Sam Popowich. I'm the acting associate dean at the University of Winnipeg Library in Canada. I have a Master in Library and Information Studies degree from a Canadian university and a PhD in political science from the University of Birmingham, where I looked at cultural studies and the work of Stuart Hall and certain library controversies around free speech, free expression, and intellectual freedom. And what I'm going to talk to you today is based in part on a journal article that I published at the beginning of this year, looking at citational justice and in particular the work of an American political theorist from the 1990s who wrote a book called Justice and the Politics of Difference, which I thought gave us a bit of a different framework in terms of understanding citational justice. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to give a brief introduction to what citational justice is. Depending on the sector that you work in or your role in the library, you may have a lot of sort of a good sense of what citational justice involves, but you might have a lesser sense. So a lot of my day-to-day work is in library systems or IT, and so I don't see citational justice on the ground very much in that role. But with sort of my political theory interests, I sort of get a better sense of citational justice in that way. Then I'm going to look a little more closely at the work of Iris Marion Young, who's the author of Justice and the Politics of Difference, and how that ties into the article that I published called The Five Faces of Citational Justice earlier this year. And the key to all this, from my perspective, is that when we talk about citational justice, we often don't get very specific about what injustice entails. What would citational injustice look like? And I think that Young's approach helps us get a better or more specific or nuanced sense of that. So I'll talk about her five faces of oppression, and then I'll sort of broaden out the discussion to what's known as the capabilities approach, which is typically associated with the names Amartya Sen in economics and Martha Nussbaum in political philosophy. But I also connect Iris Marion Young's work with this capabilities approach as well. So I think that's plenty to get on with for a 60-minute presentation. Hopefully this won't be too dense or too dry or too boring. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. And I should have time at the end for kind of real-time questions or comments if there's anything there. So to begin with, what is citational justice? So citational justice has become an important component of today's academic practice. And basically what it talks about is, are there certain demographics of researchers who are underrepresented in citations? This can get tied to sort of very mainstream conceptions of identity politics. And probably at its most superficial, it can look like an identity politics discussion around the number of citations or the number of voices that are being included in a particular academic discussion or conversation. So are women being cited more than men? Are people, or less than men? Are people of color being cited less than white people? Are people from the global south being cited less or in different ways than people from the global north? Whose voices or citations are dominating the discussion? And the problem, as I see it, is that these questions of citational justice are often tied to a dominant conception of justice overall, which is justice as fair distribution. So measured by the amount of goods or benefits that accrue to particular people. And often, this form of justice is measured or recognized, I guess, as a kind of end state pattern. So, distribution takes place, the distribution of citations, the distribution of continuing appointments in universities, the distributions of, in Canada, we have the concept of a Canada Research Chair, which is a kind of coveted chairship in a particular field. How do those things get distributed? And the idea is that we can recognize a just system by the pattern of distribution. So if we have an equal distribution of Canada Research Chairs between men and women, or between white people and people of color, then we kind of presume that the system as a whole is fundamentally just. The problem with this is that a distributive conception of justice is often value-free or empty of specific content. It doesn't look at what are the experiences of the people who are going through this process that leads to some kind of end state pattern. So even if we had an equal number of men and women in continuing appointments in universities, or people of color versus white people in occupying Canada Research Chairs, does that mean that the process that got us to that end state is itself just? Or are there injustices that are baked in, they just don't affect that end state pattern? And then these end states become very easy to co-opt to an unjust system of academic labor and academic practice. And, you know, in a kind of neoliberal situation, institutions understand that they can pay lip service to social justice questions. They can pay lip service to trans rights, for example, or diversity in hiring, so that they can achieve a sort of just-looking end state pattern, but don't actually deal with any of the underlying injustices. But in order to tackle some of that, what we need is a very clear and specific account of what constitutes injustice, besides just this unequal distribution of citations, for example, in an end state pattern. And I should say that this criticism of the distributional way of looking at citations isn't the only criticism of citational justice. So, for example, just a couple of months ago, the Journal of Radical Librarianship published a special issue on citation justice, which took a much more radical position than I take, basically seeing all of academic citation as, and this is a quote from the editors, a representational practice of hollow, ruined potential of professional accumulation and intellectual capital. And they see citational practices as being impossible to reform, because they disagree with the very idea of an institutionalized and disciplined citational practice. And these pieces basically sort of, to my mind, the rhetoric in them is very overheated, and doesn't necessarily help get a firm handle on what citational justice and injustice look like in academia and in libraries, and how we can address them. But there are valuable criticisms to be found in the writings there. So criticisms, for example, of academic standardization, of intellectual gatekeeping, of intellectual property around scholarship, and the sort of competitive situation that people are placed in industrialized academia. And I think this connects with library work and library practices, and the role of libraries in universities in particular, in a lot of very direct ways. However, I think that we can and need to be a bit more specific about the kinds of injustices that are based into citation practices, and what kind of injustices we want to avoid while we try to reform citation practices. So this can happen in the scholarship that librarians themselves engage in, and that's kind of how it directly kind of intersects with what I do. But it also intersects with the way that we support researchers and scholars in our universities. So if we're academic librarians working in a university, we're supporting researchers, we're supporting students who might be getting started in research and writing. And so we should have a good sense of where these injustices can creep in those sort of seemingly neutral scholarly practices, and how we can address them. So as I mentioned, my own criticism is that this question of citational justice very often is tied to what I would think of as a liberal distributive conception of justice, which, like liberal ideology itself, appears so much like common sense to us that it becomes invisible. And if it's invisible, then it's hard to challenge. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do is to try to make that distributive sense of citational justice a bit more explicit as a way to try to challenge it and try to dismantle it. And so to gain a better understanding of that distributive model of justice, it's useful to go back to the writings of John Rawls. John Rawls, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, basically revitalized liberal political theory, primarily in the publication of the book that I have on the left there, A Theory of Justice, which he published in 1971, and basically gave political philosophers in the West a new way of thinking about justice and political philosophy that sort of managed to get them out of the rut that they had been stuck in as part of the Cold War and ways of thinking about the Cold War. And Rawls, in this book, tries to provide, or appears to provide, a solid foundation for what he calls justice as fairness. So a fairness-oriented sense of social justice, but with fairness defined fundamentally as a question of distribution. Rawls's fairness model is a social contract model. He's very explicit about that. So it conceives of society as the free coming together of isolated individuals. So people aren't born into a society, at least kind of primordially. They are independent, self-managing, atomic individuals who decide to come together and form a society because they realize that it benefits them. The problem with the social contract theory in Rawls and in other places is that it makes ideas of structural, pre-existing, entrenched power relations inadmissible to the argument. The idea is that people are primordially free and independent, and so any question of structural injustice becomes very difficult for thinkers like Rawls to sort of get at. And as a result, ideas of structural injustice are very difficult to get into the discussion of citational injustice. So one quote from Rawls saying that the main idea of justice as fairness is a theory of justice that generalizes and carries to a higher level of abstraction the original conception of the social contract. So he's very explicit about the fact that his theory of justice is a social contract theory. The capabilities approach, which we'll look at later on, is not based on the social contract. Another thing that he writes in A Theory of Justice is one feature of justice as fairness is to think of the parties, so people coming together to form a society, as rational and mutually disinterested. This does not mean that the parties are egoists, but they are conceived as not taking an interest in one another's interests. So this is a very kind of core concept of the social justice and liberal political philosophy that comes out of it, which is that everyone is looking after their own interests. You might not think of them as purely egotistical, but they have a sense of their own interests, and their reason for coming together as a society is to look after their own interests. And again, the capabilities approach does not look at things that way. So Rawls, the kind of core of his theory of justice is what he calls the two principles of justice. The first is equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties. So people ought to kind of start out with a basic assignment, basic distribution of the things that they can ask for from their social relations and the things that they owe to society. But he bakes in this idea that inequality is permissible. So he writes that social and economic inequalities, for example, inequality of wealth and authority, are only just if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular for the least advantaged members of society. And this is something that we hear a lot in today's culture from kind of the techno oligarchs like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, that the power and wealth and influence that accrue to these individual people at the heads of technology companies is acceptable and legitimate because what they're doing, in theory, is improving society and the planet for everyone else. empirically, we can look at that and we can say that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem as if they are raising the condition of everyone in society and on the planet. But Rawls would say that empirical question is kind of beside the point. In principle, that's what they're doing. And so in principle, the inequality of wealth and influence between those people and the rest of us is acceptable in a just society. So we can see how, even though Rawls's theory of justice may appear to be value-free, it really bakes in certain kinds of liberal capitalist perspectives into what he's talking about. Um, and another thing that Rawls's theory takes seriously, which is one reason why it was so influential among liberal political philosophers starting in the 1970s, is that he takes the idea of private property for granted. So his conception of justice as fairness is defined by a fair distribution of private or at least individualized benefits. So the way that filters through into citational justice is that all of the benefits of scholarship, the material, tangible benefits of scholarship, like continuing appointment or promotion or job security, those are managed through the quantitative distribution of citations. And while Rawls admits that society is a cooperative endeavor, he sees that cooperation as involving both an identity of interests and a conflict of interests. So he writes that there's an identity of interests and social cooperation makes possible a better life for all than any would have if they were to live solely by their own efforts. And that's a very clear restatement of the social contract principle in people like John Locke in the 17th century, for example. But Rawls also goes on to say that there's this conflict of interest in that persons are not indifferent as to how the greater benefits produced by their collaboration are distributed. For in order to pursue their ends, they each prefer a larger to a lesser share. So again, there's baked in this liberal capitalist idea that we're all in competition with each other. And in a way, what Rawls' theory of justice as fairness does is it gives a kind of legitimation to this idea that we're all out to compete with other people for a larger share or a larger distribution of these rights and privileges and influence and wealth and everything like that. So we can start to see how if we look at citational justice from this purely quantitative distributive way, that there's a way that we fall into the trap of presuming things like private intellectual property or competition between academics. And the point that I'll get to in a moment is that by having these unstated assumptions around private property and competition, we end up smuggling in other forms of injustice that are invisible to that way of looking at citation. And one more quote from Rawls' theory of justice, a set of principles is required for choosing among the various social arrangements which determine this division of advantages and for underwriting an agreement on the proper distributive shares. So he's saying that there needs to be a set of principles which will help us decide which potentially unequal distribution of wealth and influence and power are acceptable for leading to some kind of just end state. And he says that these principles are the principles of social justice, not that we need to think about social justice when we're forming the principles, but that whatever principles we choose, those will become the basis of our thinking around social justice. They provide a way of assigning rights and duties in the basic institutions of society, and they define the appropriate distribution of the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. So for a long time, particularly in mainstream political philosophy and legal thinking, Rawls's theory of justice kind of held sway. It was very powerful and very influential. But there have been a number of criticisms. So the book on the right, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, in a way does for right-wing libertarian thinking what Rawls's theory of justice did for mainstream liberal thinking. So Nozick, in this book, is setting up a libertarian critique of both liberalism and left-wing thinking. And he argues that theories of distributive justice, like the one in Rawls, tend to be patterned according to this end state distribution of shares. So justice produces, a just society will produce a particular identifiable pattern of social relationships that we can then turn around and say, if we have this end state pattern of distribution, then we know that how we got there was just. We sort of make that assumption. But for Nozick, and this is a quote from Anarchy, State, and Utopia, he writes, almost every suggested principle of distributive justice is patterned. So we saw Rawls refer to a pattern. So patterns could be things like to each according to his moral merit, or needs, or marginal product, or how hard he tries, or the weighted sum of the foregoing, et cetera, et cetera. So the classic kind of socialist and communist mottos, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, those for Nozick are patterns of distribution. And he considers those kinds of patterns as unjust because they're enforcing a way of occupying social relations that are, in his view, unfree. They're constraining. So his libertarian view is not patterned in this way. No principle governs the distribution of benefits in a libertarian society. People simply get what they get. And basically what we would say about right-wing libertarianism now is people take what they can, and they just don't care what end state pattern is produced by doing that. So I'm not going to spend any more time on Nozick's kind of right-wing criticism of Rawls. I'm not particularly interested in it. But Rawls's theory of justice is open for criticism from the left as well. And this is where Iris Marion Young comes in. So Iris Marion Young died in 2006. She was quite young. She died of cancer. But in her sort of fairly short publishing career, she wrote a number of works which are quite important for what I would think of as a left-wing but still liberal conception of justice. So the first one is Justice and the Politics of Difference, which was published in 1990, a collection of essays which includes Throwing Like a Girl, which is her political analysis of science around kinesiology that went into thinking about why boys and girls throw balls differently, and Young's argument that this isn't biological, this is socially constructed. And then a posthumous publication, Responsibility for Justice, where she talks about this idea that particular groups in society, like the poor or women or people of color, are themselves responsible for the injustice meted out to them. It's a very neoliberal idea, and which she goes to great lengths to criticize. So Young writes that the distributive paradigm in John Rawls assumes a single model for all analyses of justice. All situations in which justice is at issue are analogous to the situation of persons dividing a stock of goods and comparing the size of the portions individuals have. So she's saying that Rawls's theory of justice is reductionist in the sense that among all the different ways that we can think about justice and injustice, it reduces everything to only this one way of looking at justice as distribution. And for her, because she's interested in kind of these structural questions of social life, which Rawls is not, the paradigm of justice as fairness is irredeemably infected with an atomistic individualism. She writes that such a model implicitly assumes that individuals or other agents lie as nodes or points in a social field, among whom larger or smaller bundles of social goods are assigned. Individuals are equal in this strange capitalist way, in that they can only be compared by how much they possess. And this is where kind of liberal ideas of colorblindness comes from, right? White liberals can say, for example, that they don't see color because all they're really interested in is what things are distributed between different members of society as individuals. And unfortunately, that leads to this way of looking at society that ignores all of the structural questions of justice that are quite important. So she criticizes the end state pattern view, which Nozick also criticizes, basically saying that the evaluation of whether or not a society is just involves taking one end state pattern, comparing it to another, and deciding which one of those end state patterns is more just, and then assuming that the societies that led to those end state patterns must themselves be more or less just in the same sense. But Rawls also presupposes the institutional context that determines these material distributions. So for Young, she points out that Rawls presumes a capitalist society with a capitalist mode of market-driven distribution, which is inadequate when dealing with non-material goods and resources such as respect or recognition. And this is how Young became, for me, instrumental in thinking about citational justice, because citations are things that can be distributed, but they're immaterial. They're really reflections of people's ability to speak and be heard in academic contexts, people's ability to publish research, the prestige that might associate with more or fewer citations, or the location in which people publish. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but tenure and promotion committees in North America will often look at what journal researchers publish in as a proxy for the quality of the research, and then make tenure and promotion decisions based on that. So the distribution of citation, including where people get cited, becomes connected, even though they're immaterial things, with very material goods and benefits in the academic sphere. So a classic example that people on the left will often criticize of a distributive measure of justice, which is an end state pattern that we can look at and kind of presume that things are working in a particular way, is the gross domestic product, GDP. So Amartya Sen, who's an economist, I'll get back to later in this presentation, Amartya Sen criticizes GDP as a measure of the justice of a particular society, because all it does is it measure what's distributed, what's sort of exchanged between producers in a given society. So it only measures what capitalism thinks is important to measure. It doesn't measure immaterial justice. It doesn't measure oppression. It doesn't measure domination. He makes a big point of saying it doesn't measure things like literacy, doesn't measure health outcomes, doesn't measure lifespan. So there's all these other things that we would consider crucial to a just society that GDP just ignores. And in many ways, that's at the heart of a kind of Marxist economic criticism of GDP, which is it measures only what capitalism wants to measure. So Young and Sen, and in addition, sort of Martha Nussbaum, who I'll also talk about later, reject this distributive conception of justice. And together they form a sort of small school, which is known as the capabilities approach. Sen and Nussbaum for sure are part of that. They've both written books directly dealing with capabilities. Young is sort of tangential to that, but in Justice and the Politics of Difference, she writes about capabilities as well. So this is the citation for the article that I published earlier this year on citational injustice, where I applied the work of Young to this question. And basically, I started from where Young starts out, which is that social justice has to break away from this distributive notion of justice if it wants to take things like differences of class, race, gender, sexuality seriously. And if our notion of social justice doesn't take those things seriously, then like the GDP example, it's not measuring the things that we want to measure. It's providing an end state pattern that tells us nothing about people's lived experience, meaning that our social justice goals might end up being counterproductive or even reinscribe injustice at the heart of academic work. And I know it's sometimes the next question in librarianship, but I'm one of the people who thinks that social justice, questions of injustice are central to the work that librarians do, both in a public or municipal context and in academia. Now, Young is not a Marxist. I am very much on the Marxist side of the equation. Most of what I've written for libraries takes a Marxist approach. So I was interested in thinking through Young's work from a Marxist perspective, thinking about citations as part of what we might call the political economy of academia and knowledge work, and as a kind of currency. And a lot of the citational justice literature will talk about citations as a form of currency, even though they're immaterial. But most importantly, in this article, I found it important to clearly identify what kind of injustice is involved in scholarship and in citational work. And Young kind of puts it this way. Distributed theories of justice sees people solely as possessors and consumers of material goods. But this ignores significant non-possessing and consuming areas of people's experience. Obviously, we are possessors and consumers. We do those things. We need food to live. We need housing. We need all kinds of material elements in our lives that we consume. And so those have to be distributed through society in some way. But we're not only possessors and consumers. And part of the reductionism of the Rawls approach is that he basically sees us solely as producers and consumers. But Young writes that that's only one aspect of human social life. We are also doers and actors. And this idea that we're not just possessors and consumers, but we're doers and actors is very central to the capabilities approach in Sen and Nussbaum as well. And I feel like this in particular should resonate with librarians. There can be a tendency in our field to sometimes treat library users, whether those are students or members of the public, as merely seeking to possess and consume information. And that leads to library services that focus solely on distribution and access. And so in that sense, just library services might be about equal or equitable distribution of library stock, making sure that people have access to the building, making sure that people have access to our resources in an equitable way. And all of that is important. But it's not sufficient in itself. If we take seriously the idea that library users are also doers and makers, then this requires expanding the notion of library services and explains the non-distributional services and programming that libraries also provide, and it's important for them to provide. For example, in a university library context, teaching and support around citation styles and citation practices, to my mind, has less to do with students as possessors and consumers of information, though it is also partly that, but it has a lot more to do with them as doers and makers of scholars in their own right, and kind of the subjective or phenomenological experience of thinking and reading and writing and engaging in other people's work. And so for Young, focusing on the areas ignored by the distributive paradigm of justice, the way that peoples are doers and makers in addition to being consumers and possessors, enables us to understand kinds of injustice that are invisible to those distributive approaches, like the approach of Rawls. And Young sums up these areas of injustice as oppression and domination. So the quote on the screen here kind of sums up what she's thinking about in terms of oppression and domination. Oppression for her is institutional constraints on self-development. So the way that our institutions, libraries, universities, municipalities place constraints on people's ability to develop themselves intellectually, emotionally, socially, all of that. Austerity, for example, is kind of the classic way of thinking about institutional constraints on self-development. Austerity cuts out the ability of many people in British society, Canadian society, American society to participate in certain things, certain social relations that lead them to fully develop their own capacities and powers as doers and makers. In addition to oppression, Young talks about domination, and domination for her are institutional constraints on self-determination. So oppression is about the ability to fully develop the powers of being a maker and a doer in yourself. Self-determination is about how to choose the direction in which your doing and making operates. How do I decide what to work on? How do I decide how to occupy my time or spend my energy? Do I have any say in that, or is that simply placed on me by the institutions that I'm working with? And again, I think austerity is really the big example of how domination in that sense can operate in Western societies. And because Young talks about institutions, we can see right away that it's less of an individualistic model than the Rawls model. And it's not about an end state pattern, because what she's concerned about are two processes, processes of self-development and processes of self-determination. So they don't just look at how a society looks in the end and says, well, it must have been just to get there. It actually looks at what people's lived experiences were over time and whether they encountered injustice in the form of oppression or domination as they go through that work. So it's sometimes tempting to understand citational justice according to the distributional model, and a lot of the literature, I think, does that. looking at the distribution of citations as a proxy for participating in scholarly discourse, and the distribution of benefits or privileges of academic life according to the distribution of citations. As I mentioned, this is what tenure and promotion committees do in North America. But I think we can open up new ways of thinking about citational justice if we take seriously Young's non-distributive conception of justice, which means that we need to consider ways that citational practices may be both oppressive and dominating in the way that she talks about. So in Canada, one of the questions that comes up is how is research funding distributed? We have three agencies that handle medical research, natural science research, and humanities research. They distribute government funding for research projects. Citation feeds into who gets that funding. Who gets that funding feeds into people's prestige and job prospects within the academic work system in Canada. And so citation very much feeds into these sort of longer term processes of justice or injustice over time. I'm not an expert on the UK ref system, but I have found some citations that indicate to me that the ref system may also have some of these baked in questions of injustice as oppression or domination into it. And so the question, similarly for Canada, how does the distribution of citations affect RAF evaluation and research funding? So here's a quote from an LSE blog from 2011, so it's quite a while ago now, where it talks about evidence for funding, looking at a definition of research output, which included the impact of a journal as a proxy for the value to be attached for every journal published, which is again what I was thinking of in terms of the way that in North America we look at the location that people publish as a proxy for the quality of research, and then that feeds into very material distribution of particular benefits. So the argument that I made in my Kula article is that Western citation practices may be both oppressive and dominating in Young's definition, in that scholarly practices will block some scholars but not others from developing and using their knowledge and skills in academically recognized ways. And because they subject some scholars but not others to official or unofficial institutional processes that will block their self-determination. These practices and processes include editorial decisions, peer review at the level of the journal, but also hiring and promotion committees at the level of institution, and in fact, research funding distribution at the level of the country. And Young identifies what she calls the 5 faces of oppression in contemporary society. And I looked at the ways these 5 areas apply to citational justice. So she starts out with exploitation, which is a notion that she gets from Marx, which is that oppression occurs through a steady process of the transfer of the results of labor from one social group to benefit another. So if the leader of a research project takes credit for a publication and doesn't credit the people working under them, that can be a mode of exploitation. Oftentimes, ideas that are published by women researchers will get repeated by men without citation or without attribution in their research articles. And in my article, I sort of cite a UK-based researcher named Jana Basevich, who writes a lot about, in particular, the gender imbalance in crediting or taking credit for research, which she links with the idea of sort of standpoint epistemology and epistemological injustice, which I kind of see as a larger frame of citational injustice. Second face that Young identifies is marginalization. Marginals are people the system of labor cannot or will not use. So again, we have more and more a growing underclass of precariously employed academics and researchers who can often be considered, disposable. They might not be officially attached to a university or an academic institution, which makes it harder for them to publish, which makes it harder for them to get cited, which makes it harder for them to get permanent employment. And so the distribution of citations kind of reinforces the marginalization of certain populations. Powerlessness. This is where I think the fact that Young's book is 30 years old, 35 years old, betrays itself. Young equates power with professional status and powerlessness as not being a professional. And I think what we've seen in the intervening 35 years is that even within the professional designations, so professional librarians or professional academics, various power imbalances have come up, especially between sort of these precariously employed or underemployed or unemployed academic workers or librarians. Cultural imperialism, this is an important one, I think, for libraries to experience how the dominant meanings of society render the particular perspectives of one's own group invisible at the same time as they stereotype one's group and mark it out as the other. So in my research on Stuart Hall, who was a really important cultural studies figure from the 60s through into the 90s, as he talks about first the conservative demonization of immigrants, trade unionists, and things like that under Thatcher, moving to the way that neoliberalism then constructs particular racial categories within British society. We can see how that works. And I think that as librarians, part of our social justice orientation needs to be to understand how this cultural imperialism works and how we can attempt to counter it. Citational justice is one of the ways I think that we can do that. Violence, in academic libraries, violence is not something, physical violence is not something that we face terrifically often, but in public libraries, obviously, violence is a kind of growing concern. But Young is also, one of the important insights I think that she makes is whether or not a particular violent action occurs is in some ways less important or less significant in terms of oppression and domination than whether the social conditions that might produce that act of violence occur. Is violence possible against particular groups? And we can see this, for example, in all the debates in Britain and North America around trans rights and trans visibility. Are certain discourses making violence against trans people more acceptable, more tolerable, or even worse, expected? And Young gets at all of that. And while I don't think there's a direct connection between citational justice and immediate acts of violence, this idea of the discursive construction of a situation in which acts of violence become possible or even expected does fit into this question of citational injustice. I didn't talk about the capabilities approach in my article. I'm just going to run through a little bit of this sort of fairly quickly. Sen in the late 90s through to Martha Nussbaum's contribution in the late 2000s, Development as Freedom and Creating Capabilities. Both are looking at the capabilities approach as a human development function. So the UN, for example, had their Millennium Development Goals, which was an attempt to set benchmarks for societies to reach, so that globally as a society we could imagine that we were doing things to promote equity, justice, inclusion as a mode of social development. And the capabilities approach really comes out of that. And one of the things that they talk about, Sen talks about in particular, is what he calls capability deprivation, where he says that both Sen and Nussbaum talk about capabilities as things that accrue to human people. Nussbaum has a list of central capabilities that we'll look at in a second. But that injustice really amounts to the deprivation of particular capabilities. So if people have things that they value, things in their lives that are of value, abilities to be doers and makers that are valuable to them and valuable to the people around them, and then they're prevented from exercising those things or developing themselves in those ways, then that is an injustice. And so this is what ties Sen's approach to me with Young's approach, and therefore to this question of citational injustice. The ability to be a maker and doer in the academic space, doing research and scholarship, is a thing that people value. And if we deprive them of that ability to do it, then we may be sort of acting unjustly, both in terms of oppression and domination, by depriving them of these central capabilities. So for Nussbaum, the central capabilities for her are life. That one we would hope would go without saying, but with a lot of the things that we've been seeing globally recently, particularly in the US, particularly in Israel and Palestine, particularly in Russia and Ukraine, life is not a given. But one of the central capabilities of Nussbaum and Sen is that life is a central capability, that it is a central element of justice to support. Bodily health, bodily integrity, that can be around reproductive rights, that can be around gender expression, that can be around eradication of disease. Sense, imagination, and thought, I think that this ties most directly into what we as librarians are involved in. Emotions, artistic expression, that kind of thing. Practical reason, are we able to live ethically, or do we live in a society where we are able to live ethically, or are we constrained by institutional rules and policies and procedures to act unethically? I think this comes up a lot in some of the library controversies that I've investigated in my own research, where librarians and library staff and workers feel as if they're being forced to act unethically in order to support certain library policies and procedures. Affiliation, are we able to associate with people without constraint? Other species, not only do other species have capabilities that we ought to protect, but are we able to live in a society that respects the central capabilities of other species? So we can think around about this in terms of vegetarianism and veganism and industrial farming. Play, how is play regarded? Do we live in a society where human beings have the luxury and leisure time to play? That's kind of important. And control over one's environment. Are we able to make spaces for ourselves that support our abilities to self-develop and self-determine as makers and doers? Sense, imagination, and thought. Again, I just want to underline this one, where Nussbaum really sort of underlines how important being able to use imagination and thought is in experiencing and producing artistic, literary, religious, musical works, and I would include scholarship in this as well. So this ties directly into questions of citational practice. And as I say, Young, to me, fits into this capabilities approach school that includes Sen and Nussbaum. In Justice and the Politics of Difference, she talks about the fact that justice can't only be about distribution, but also the institutional conditions necessary for the development and exercise of individual capacities and collective communication and cooperation. To me, that's kind of the central idea of the capabilities approach. And injustice, involves two disabling constraints: oppression and domination. And she sort of defines areas of people's lives around decision-making, the division of labor, and culture as three broad categories where we ought to be trying to foster a sense of justice. And to my mind, Nussbaum's list of central capabilities fit into those three categories. And just to end on this note, citational practice, citational justice seems like a very specific and potentially a very new question for us, but all of these ideas around human beings as makers and doers and people who exist in a larger social world where we have ethical requirements and where we need to take ethical and political considerations seriously are very old. They go back to the origins of Western philosophy. They're known in Greek, for example, as poiesis, praxis, and ousia, questions of making, doing, and being. And so, even if citational justice and injustice seems like it might be a small part of the practice of librarianship or the practice of universities, it ties into these larger and deeper questions that I think it's important and continually relevant for librarians and other library workers to think seriously about and to engage in. So that was very quick. I hope that wasn't too dense. I hope it wasn't too sort of dry and boring. If you feel like it, the article that I wrote is free and open access. It's available online. The slides here are available, and you can get the title of the article out of that. And I go into a bit more detail about Young's approach and how Young thinks about injustice, though I don't spend too much time on Sen and Nussbaum in that article. So with that said, thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes, I think, for questions, comments, anything you'd like to add.
Thanks so much, Sam. And that was really interesting, and not dry at all. It was really, it's, I mean, I'm a theory nerd, so I certainly enjoy getting into that. And it looks like, yeah, some folks in the chat agree.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to change the settings so that folks can unmute themselves if they would like to make a question or a comment. Um, do feel free just to pop your hand up first, though, just so that we know.
I do see a question in the chat as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is from Gullen. Definitely want to incorporate some of this in my work. Can I summarize again the difference between consumer producer versus doer maker? I think I'm getting hung up on the wording here because maker sounds similar to producer. Is it passive versus active? Is it the Marx version of work versus labor? I think it is very close to the Marx version of work versus labor. Young's idea of exploitation is definitely directly drawn from Marx. I think I would think of it as a version of Marx's work versus labor. So unalienated labor, the work that we do as human beings, that we are fully engaged in and not doing simply because we're being paid for it, where the products of the labor are alienated from us. I've written a couple of books on the politics of librarianship from a Marxist perspective, where I do talk about alienated labor versus engaged work, and the fact that I think the work of librarianship, we're kind of, I would hope, in a lot of ways, one of the last holdouts where even if a lot of our work is alienated and unfulfilling, there are still aspects of it which we are not hugely alienated from and engaged with. So to me, maker and doer, yeah, those are abilities of our being in the world which are not rendered alienated by capitalist social relations. So I use the examples of people who garden, people who cook, people who repair their own bicycles. All of that is work. But if you're doing it for yourself and you're not being paid a salary for it, capitalism excludes all that. But the Marxist view is that we have a very human impetus to do that kind of unengaged work. We're in a work that needs to be transformed to fit our needs. And to give us things to consume. And this is where the distinction gets a bit fuzzy. And so I think one of the important things to remember is that for Young, it's not that we aren't consumers and producers. It's that in the kind of capitalist Rawlsian version, we are only consumers and producers. So there is some overlap between a consumer and producer and a doer maker. But analytically, it's nice to tease those apart. I think it is a both and situation. Yeah, I think the edges are not particularly fuzzy. One of the things about reading all of these people like Young and Rawls and Nozick is that concepts or categories that they put forward as being fairly clear cut. You kind of have to bear in mind that those are for analytic purposes, and in reality, they're much messier than that. Yeah. No problem. If questions or comments occur to anyone after this presentation, after the conference, feel free to drop me an email. I'm always happy to chat about these things.
Excellent. Any other comments or questions? I can see a comment there from Sarah that you've got to run. Totally understand. It is past 5 o'clock in the UK at least. So yeah, for a lot of us, we're outside of our standard office hours now.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Sam. If we could all please express our thanks, either as reactions or in the chat, that would be great. Thank you so much. Yeah, lots of food for thought for us there.